See, that phrase comes at the end of the Beatitudes, Jesus' snapshot of what a kingdom life looks like, what a life of radical devotion to him looks like. And in the Beatitudes, what Jesus says is, those who follow me are radically dependent on God for everything. They are broken by the brokenness of the world. They are humble and servant-hearted and submissive to everybody. They hunger for justice. They're merciful beyond merciful. They live with this deep character and integrity. They live to make peace in the world, and they will do it despite persecution. And Jesus says, if you live that sort of radical devotion to me, that's the saltiness, that's the distinctiveness that makes you different than the whole rest of the world. That's what the world needs from the church. And when you lose that, you lose everything. It says, if the salt loses its saltiness, the chemists in the room are laughing and saying, but salt can't lose its saltiness. Sodium chloride is a stable compound that can never be anything other than sodium chloride. So what does Jesus mean? How does the salt lose its saltiness? Well, it turns out in the ancient world there's more than one kind of salt. There's pure salt from the Mediterranean where you boil off the water and you get mostly sodium chloride. But the cheap stuff that everybody can afford is actually impure salt that you get from boiling off the water of the Dead Sea. And you end up with sodium chloride, yes, but you also end up with a whole bunch of other minerals mixed in, things like gypsum that look an awful lot like sodium chloride but just aren't salt. And so people go to the market and they buy this massive quantity of impure salt because they can afford it, and they take it back to their house and they pile it behind their house, and then the rain comes. And the rain starts to beat against this pile of salt, and what happens is all the sodium chloride dissolves in the rainwater and leaches out of the pile. And at the end of the rainstorm, what you have left is a pile that looks an awful lot like salt but has no sodium chloride in it. It has lost its saltiness. And once your salt pile loses its saltiness, it's not good for any of the purposes that we talked about before. In fact, it can only be used for one thing. People would take it and they would spread it around the courtyard of their house. They'd spread it on the flat roof. They'd spread it everywhere where people walked, because the one property this pile has is that it will harden the ground and make it easier to walk on. The only thing this non-salty salt pile can be used for is to be thrown out and trampled on by people. Jesus says, once you lose that distinctiveness, once you sacrifice that radical discipleship, once people can look at you and no longer see me, you have lost your ability to be used for my purposes in the world, and it's really, really hard to get that back. Not because you've lost your salvation or anything like that, but anybody who's lost their reputation knows once your credibility is gone, it is very, very, very hard to get that back. And that's what my ancestors lost in Russia, the credibility of discipleship to Jesus Christ, a lifestyle that reeked of the person of Jesus, that made people sit up and take notice and say, I need to know more about that. And so this is the challenge that Jesus throws down. Live a life of radical discipleship. Live a life of dependence on God for everything instead of trying to be strong. Live a life of brokenness in the world instead of worrying about your own comfort. Live a life of radical, servant-hearted submissiveness rather than trying to be the arrogant, strong, powerful leader. Live a life that's hungry for justice rather than trying to take advantage of injustice. Live a life that is merciful rather than judgmental. Live a life that has deep character rather than being hypocritical. Live a life that exists to make peace in the world between people and God, between people and their own broken spirits and souls, between people and each other, between people and the world. And live that way even though it's going to cost you dearly. Live that way even in the face of persecution. You live a heart that is fully devoted to knowing and loving and serving God above everything else, and you live a heart that is fully devoted to knowing and loving and serving everybody else as much as you love yourself. And Jesus says, you watch what I will do. He says in Matthew 5:16, he says, so let your light shine, changes metaphors, before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. He says, when other people see you living a life like that, they themselves will become worshipers. They will be drawn into a life of faith in Jesus Christ, and He will begin to transform their lives, and they will become the salt of the earth, and the gospel will continue to spread and to grow. Because I believe, according to Jesus, you will never do what God has called you to do until you're ready to radically be what God has created you to be.